So Andy Warhol was well known for his interest in fame and fortune and things you could buy. In his artwork, though, he actually dealt with a lot of other aspects of American culture. So what you're seeing here is part of his Death and Disaster series, which stretched through the mid-1960s. This is from 1964, and he's taking an image of a car crash that he took from a newspaper article. He's taken that photograph, had it blown up big, and then silkscreened it over and over again on a very large canvas that's painted in orange in the background. He took an interest in the way that the media, specifically newspapers and television, would take an event, something that happened in the world, and then by repeating it over and over and over again, created something different in the public perception of that thing. It takes an event and turns it into the news, and it's something that people know about and receive in a different way than they would perceive things in reality. So it's the effects of the media that he's really in touch with here. So in this series that looks at things that were going on in the world around Andy Warhol, he took photographs from the civil rights movement, specifically this photograph from a major protest, and then turned that into one of his artworks as well. And it so happens that the photograph that Andy Warhol used was from Life magazine. And Life magazine was very widespread at the time. It was very standard for everybody to get Life magazine delivered at home. So articles that were published in Life magazine were just like bread and butter for everybody's news. So these were familiar images to American consumers, but they were of course very disturbing images, and they reflected major upheaval and desire for change in American life and culture. It's not really a simple thing that Andy Warhol did by using these photographs that were still fresh in people's minds, um, of very real violence and agitation for change. Life magazine, remember when they published these photographs, they published these extremely powerful photographs, but their text implicated the demonstrators for provoking police. And then when Andy Warhol goes on and makes these into his artwork, he has this way of pointing at things without really passing judgment. And then it falls on us as the viewers to decide how we're going to respond to them. So in Andy Warhol's artworks of these photographs from Birmingham, he uses the colors of the American flag, the red and white and blue, to create a background for the images that are overlaid on top of them, and then he's made his own artworks out of them. As so often happens, the paintings that Andy Warhol made came up to auction many years later. It so happens that this set of silk screens went sold at auction for $62.9 million. He because Warhol had used these photographs without the permission of the photographer way back when in the 1960s, when this kind of thing wasn't really an issue the way it has become in the meantime. Ultimately, Andy Warhol was taken to court by the owners of the rights to the photographs, and they settled out of court. So we don't really know how much the photographer ended up making off of this. Andy Warhol did not work in isolation. He loved the social scene. And while he had this sort of affectless persona, in public he was not emotionally expressive. He had this sort of blankness to him. He loved being surrounded by fun, exciting, dynamic people. And he loved the power that he had to take the people around him and turn them into stars. As a result, he was surrounded constantly by people who wanted to become stars, and this was the world that he loved. So he had this sort of 24-hour party kind of revolving around him, but in addition to that, it's happening in the space where he's making art. So for a period of time in the mid 1960s, he turned this studio that he was working in New York City. He and some of his co-workers there turned it into what they called the Silver Factory, just covering every surface that they could with aluminum foil, so it was all glittery and shiny. So in the daytime, he and his studio assistants are just working and cranking out the artwork, and at nighttime they're having all these people over for parties, and that is the social world that people are thinking of when they think of Andy Warhol. So that's one reason that at the Warhol Museum, they have these events on Fridays. They call them Good Fridays, when you can go to the Warhol, actually, not necessarily during COVID, but most of the time, when under normal circumstances, you can go to the Warhol and you can hear music and eat food and, have adult beverages if you're old enough. And it's all a party scene, and the galleries are open because it's all part of the same scene, because the world that Andy Warhol was a part of in the 1960s was not a place where you see an artwork and it's on this white wall and everything is quiet and you just sort of stand and reflect on the artwork. It was when people saw Andy Warhol's work at this time, even if it was in a gallery, okay, even if you're the only person there in the gallery, what you're seeing in this artwork is something that's produced by this world of fame and fashion and glitz and glamour and people wanting to be stars. That became part of what people associated with the artwork. So seeing artwork at the Warhol in this sort of party environment is totally in keeping with the environment in which this artwork was made and what people made from it at the time. Part of the world of the factory that Warhol worked in was making movies. So he and some of the other people that he worked with in the factory would set up these movie cameras. And when people would come to the studio, either just to hang out or to have meetings, or when they were there for parties, he would sit them down in front of this film camera and just like run a full reel of 8 millimeter film, just with them sitting there looking at the camera, and he would call that a screen test. So he would get from them out of this sitting, he would get a film that is just their face. At the Warhol, you can go and watch some of these, what he called screen tests, and the effect is something like a painting that just moves a little bit, because you'll see facial expressions. So sometimes you'll see somebody talking to somebody outside of the frame, but visually it's just that face just right in the middle of the screen. So it's kind of an act of staring. It's like you can just stare at this face because film has distanced the person from the experience of the artwork. It's sort of an outgrowth of the world of the painting. But beyond that, he also made movies, but you got to put movies in kind of quotation marks because the movies that they made at the factory are practically unwatchable as movies, but they still exist as movies, and you can search them down online. And sometimes they have film festivals at the Warhol where you can see them. Andy Warhol was shot at the peak of his fame and desirability as an artist, when he was surrounded by people who all wanted a piece of him, he had trouble saying no. And one of the people, a woman named Valerie Solanas, who had this very extreme version of a screenplay that she wanted him to produce, he couldn't tell her no, and that he didn't want to work with her. He just like kept trying to avoid her, and so she sort of lost it at one point, came up to the factory and just started shooting. He practically died. He was horribly injured, and barely survived in the operating room. Took him a very long time to recover to the point that he could make art again. So what you're seeing here is a photograph by Richard Avedon, who was like the most famous and popular fashion photographer at the time, also an extraordinary portrait photographer. He was one of the very few people who got to see these scars on Andy Warhol's chest and then publish a photograph in the magazine. He was never the same again after he was shot. After Andy Warhol was shot and after his recovery, he did return to making art. It had sort of a different feeling to it than the work that was made before, and the artwork seemed to be much more oriented towards the business of making art. That's when he started Interview Magazine, which was very popular all throughout his lifetime and just sort of perpetuated that star system through the print medium. And Andy Warhol did continue to circulate in the nightlife. He was a regular fixture on the Studio 54 nightlife scene, and he continued to have people come over to his place, to the factory. But it wasn't really the party scene that he used to be there. But these are examples of his Polaroids. So Andy Warhol loved stars and loved fame, made Polaroids whenever he had the opportunity to, and these Polaroids became later part of finished silkscreen paintings a lot of the time. Sometimes they just were worth keeping just as Polaroids for their own sake. Among the media that Andy Warhol liked being a part of, number one, television. He had a public access TV show in New York City back when public access was a thing. You can see videos from that TV series at the Warhol Museum. He was a guest star on Love Boat. He advertised products on TV. He became a spokesperson for various brands for different campaigns. And he, at the very end of his life, as it turns out, towards the very end of his career, he took up computer graphics. So there are stories that say that Steve Jobs approached him to try to get him to try the graphics on the Apple computer, but Andy Warhol didn't really get along with Steve Jobs, and he ended up taking up the Amiga instead. So here you can see a production photograph from his from a promotional event that he did for the Amiga, where he's using the graphics to make a digital image of Debbie Harry. Andy Warhol passed away in 1987, in the spring of 1987, and when people look back on his legacy, one of the big ideas that has come to connect with Andy Warhol's legacy is the idea that after Andy Warhol's work, you cannot truly see an artwork independently of its context. What we mean by that is that if you, in the 1960s, if you went into a gallery and walked into to a space where they were exhibiting the Brillo boxes, for example, it would be entirely possible for you or me or a random person without context, just walking in, to look at these boxes and not see art at all. We would be seeing just Brillo boxes because if we don't look closely enough, we might completely mistake them for just shipping containers that Brillo boxes were in. Like I mean, the actual Brillo pads were in. The shipping cartons for this commercial product that were what Andy Warhol was trying to mimic with these sculptures, and we could really completely miss out on everything that they do as artworks with all of the fun and the peculiar balance. Is it satire? Is it celebration? All of these connections to American life and culture and consumption. All of these ideas that artwork can bring to us and get us involved in and connect with. If we don't have that context, we miss out on all of that, and that's what makes the art in the first place. Without that context, it's entirely possible to miss it all, and then we don't get to see it as artwork without that context. So there's more to Andy Warhol. Go to the Warhol Museum if you have the opportunity to. His influence on art continues to be pervasive to this day, and he's an artist who you can definitely say changed the world. He changed the way that we see things, and an artist still has the ability to do that, to influence culture in that way.